The small alien girl lived in a cold, dark house at the edge of a village. She had never known warmth, love, or safety. Her parents had vanished when she was very young. Now she had only her stepmother, who never showed her any kindness. The girl's name was Lyra, but it seemed like no one ever called her that with love. Her stepmother only used her for hard work. Every day was the same. Lyra woke up early, long before the sun had risen. Her stepmother would already be awake, watching her with cold eyes. Lyra was expected to clean the house, gather food, and do all the chores while her stepmother sat and watched. There was no rest for Lyra. Every time she made a mistake, even the smallest one, her stepmother would shout at her. "Why can't you do anything right?" Her stepmother would say, her voice full of anger. "You're nothing but trouble." The girl never cried. She had learned long ago that tears only made things worse. Instead, she worked harder, hoping that one day things would get better. But they never did. Lyra's only escape was the small garden behind the house. It wasn't much, just a few flowers and some plants, but it was the only place where she could sit in peace for a few moments. Here, she could imagine a better life. A life where she wasn't just a servant, where someone cared for her. But even in the garden, she couldn't stay long. Her stepmother would always find a reason to call her back inside. "You think you can sit around doing nothing?" her stepmother would shout. "Get back to work." Lyra never argued. She knew better. Her stepmother had always been cruel, and Lyra had no choice but to obey. As the days passed, the girl grew quieter. Her shoulders hunched under the weight of the work, and her eyes lost their spark. She didn't smile anymore. She couldn't remember the last time she had. One day, her stepmother came to her with a cruel smile on her face. She was holding something in her hand, a small piece of paper. Lyra felt a cold knot in her stomach as she watched her stepmother approach. "You're going to be sold," her stepmother said, her voice cold and sharp. "I've had enough of you. You're just a burden." Lyra's heart sank. She didn't understand. Sold. She had heard stories about slaves, people who were bought and sold like cattle. She had never thought it would happen to her. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg for mercy, but no words came out. What could she say? Her stepmother had never cared about her, not once. "You'll be gone tomorrow," her stepmother continued. "I've already arranged everything. Don't bother packing your things. You'll be better off as a slave. Maybe someone will take pity on you." The words felt like a slap to Lyra's face. She wasn't even good enough to be cared for. She was nothing. No one would care about her. Lyra's mind raced. What would happen to her now? What was waiting for her at the auction? Would she ever be free again? That night, Lyra couldn't sleep. She lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. Her stepmother was in the next room, laughing, talking to someone. She didn't care about Lyra. She never had. Lyra wanted to cry. She wanted to scream. But she held it in. She had learned long ago that no one would listen. No one would help. She was alone in the world. The next morning, her stepmother made her pack a small bag. There wasn't much to pack, just a few old clothes and some food. When Lyra was ready, her stepmother dragged her out of the house and into a cart. They rode for hours, the journey feeling longer than it ever had before. Lyra didn't know where they were going, but she didn't ask. She didn't care anymore. When they finally arrived, Lyra saw people standing around, talking to each other. There were many others like her, girls, boys, all ages, all different species. Some looked scared like her. Others looked numb, like they had already given up. Lyra tried to look away from their eyes, but she couldn't help it. They were all in the same terrible situation. Her stepmother pushed her forward, telling her to stand still. A man came up to Lyra, looking her over. He didn't smile. He didn't speak to her. He just nodded to her stepmother and walked away. Lyra was next. She stood on a small platform, her heart racing. The auctioneer stood in front of her, holding a clipboard. He looked at Lyra as though she were just another object to sell. "Up for auction today," the auctioneer called out. "This young alien girl, clean and healthy, ready for work." He didn't even bother to look at her face. Lyra felt like she was invisible. Her stepmother stood off to the side, her arms crossed, watching with no emotion. Lyra's life was about to change, but she didn't know how much worse it could get. All she could do was wait and hope. Though deep down, she knew that hope was fading fast. The slave auction. The sun was high in the sky when Lyra arrived at the slave auction. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hands shook. She had never felt so alone. The cart that had carried her from her old home now stopped in front of a large building. It was crowded, filled with people standing in lines, talking and laughing as if they were buying goods. But Lyra wasn't a good or a thing to buy. She was a person. She felt small and scared among the strangers. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and something worse, something that made Lyra's stomach twist. She looked around, trying to find a friendly face, but all she saw were cold eyes and serious faces. She quickly looked down at the ground, too afraid to meet anyone's gaze. Her stepmother, who had stayed quiet during the ride, shoved her roughly forward. "Stand straight," she ordered. "Look like you have some worth." But how could Lyra stand tall when she felt so small, so worthless? She had never felt so exposed in her life. A group of other slaves were lined up nearby, all of them waiting for their turn to be sold. Some were crying. Others stared blankly ahead, lost in their own thoughts. Lyra tried to stay calm, but it was hard. She had never seen so many people like her, so many people who were treated as less than nothing. It was a terrible feeling. Her stepmother walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Lyra alone on the platform. The girl's heart raced even faster. The fear that gripped her was almost too much to bear. She didn't know what to expect, but she had heard enough stories. People were bought for all sorts of reasons: to work, to clean, to serve. But no one ever bought a slave to care for them. She would never be treated like a person. She would only be used. A loud voice cut through the air, drawing Lyra's attention. "Step right up, everyone. The auction is about to begin. Today's first item is a young alien girl, healthy and ready for work. She is perfect for anyone looking for a new servant." Lyra's stomach turned. She didn't want to be sold. She didn't want to be anyone's servant. But what could she do? There was no way out. She had no choice but to stand there and wait as her stepmother handed over the money and signed the papers. The auctioneer was a tall man with a sharp, cold face. His eyes scanned Lyra as if she were just another item to be sold. He didn't see her as a person. He only saw the money she could bring. He gave her a quick look before turning back to the crowd. "We'll start the bidding. I'm sure someone here will find this girl useful." Lyra felt sick. She didn't know what was worse, being on the platform or the way people looked at her. Some of them eyed her like she was a prize, others like she was nothing. A man in the front raised his hand, calling out a price. "I'll offer 200 credits for her." The auctioneer nodded. 200 credits. Who will go higher?" His voice was loud and sharp, making Lyra flinch. She wanted to hide, to run away, but there was no escape. She was trapped. The bidding continued, each person calling out more credits than the last. Lyra felt the weight of the money, each price making her feel more worthless. She wanted to scream, to tell them she was a person, not something to be sold. But she couldn't. Her voice was silent, trapped in her throat. 300 credits, shouted a man in the back. Lyra's eyes went wide. She didn't understand why people were bidding so much money on her. What did they want with her? 400, a woman shouted, and then the bids began to rise faster. Lyra felt dizzy as the numbers grew higher. She had no idea what was happening or what would happen next. It was all too much. She wanted to escape, to run far away from this place, but she had no strength left. Finally, after what felt like forever, the bidding stopped. The auctioneer looked at the crowd, then at Lyra. "Sold." he called out, his voice booming. Lyra looked up, not sure what to expect. Who had bought her? What would they do to her? She turned and saw an old human man standing in the back, his face serious but kind. He was different from the others. He didn't seem to see her like the others did, like a piece of property. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw something in them, a kind of understanding, maybe even sympathy. The man stepped forward, his movements slow but sure. He walked up to the auctioneer and handed over the credits. The auctioneer gave him a nod and walked away, leaving Lyra standing there, her heart still racing. The man reached out his hand to her. "Come with me," he said, his voice deep but soft. "You don't need to be afraid anymore." Lyra hesitated. Was he kind? Was he just another person who would use her? But there was something about him that made her trust him, even if just a little. She took a slow step toward him. The man didn't rush her. He didn't grab her arm or force her to move. He simply waited, watching her closely. "You're safe now," he said again, this time with more warmth in his voice. Lyra felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this man was different. Maybe her life could change after all. The soldier buys her. Lyra stood frozen, staring at the old human soldier. Her heart still pounded in her chest, and her thoughts were racing. She had just been sold to a stranger, and she had no idea what would happen next. The man was different from the others. His clothes were worn, and his face was lined with age, but there was something about him that made her feel safe. No, that couldn't be right. She had been betrayed before. No one could be trusted. Yet, as he took a step closer, Lyra felt a small flicker of hope. The man didn't speak right away. He simply looked at her, his brown eyes soft and full of something Lyra couldn't quite understand. His gaze was calm, not like the others who had looked at her like she was just a thing to buy. This man didn't seem interested in using her. He wasn't looking at her body or how much she could work. He was looking at her face, as if trying to see into her soul. Lyra didn't know what to do. She had never been treated with such care. Her stepmother had always been harsh, shouting at her for the smallest mistakes. Even the auctioneer hadn't bothered to speak to her with any kindness. But this soldier, he didn't look at her like a slave. He looked at her like she was something valuable, something worth saving. The soldier took a deep breath and spoke gently, his voice calm and reassuring. "You don't have to be afraid," he said. His words were simple, but they made Lyra feel something she hadn't felt in so long. Relief. The auctioneer's voice cut through the moment, dragging Lyra back to reality. "You've bought her, sir," he said, handing the soldier a piece of paper and taking the credits. The soldier nodded, handing the man the money without hesitation. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She was now his, but not like she had been to her stepmother. She wasn't sure what this meant, but she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The soldier wasn't shouting or pulling her harshly. He simply turned and started walking, motioning for her to follow. Lyra hesitated for a moment. She had been trained to obey commands, but for the first time, the idea of obeying didn't feel so frightening. With a deep breath, she took a step forward, her feet moving slowly at first, unsure. But the soldier didn't look back. He just kept walking, as if he believed she would follow. And so she did. They walked through the crowded auction hall, past the other slaves who looked at Lyra with a mix of jealousy and curiosity. Some were still being sold, others already bought, and some just sat there, waiting for their turn. Lyra's chest tightened as she passed them. They all looked so lost, so broken. Could she ever escape that fate? Would she ever feel free again? The soldier led her outside to a small cart waiting by the door. It wasn't much, just a simple wooden cart with a tired old horse. The soldier didn't seem to mind. He helped her onto the cart and climbed in beside her. His movements were slow, but steady, as though he wasn't in any hurry. There was a quiet strength about him, one that made Lyra feel more at ease. As the cart began to move, Lyra looked out at the world around her. It was the first time in her life that she had been outside without fear. There were no angry shouts, no harsh commands, only the sound of the horses' hooves against the dirt road. The wind was cool, and the sun shone down in a way that made the world seem a little less cold. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lyra felt something she couldn't name. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was trust. Whatever it was, she didn't want to let it go. She wasn't sure if she could trust this soldier, but she knew one thing: he had saved her from the auction. That had to mean something. They traveled for a long time. The road stretched out before them, winding through hills and forests. Lyra didn't speak. She wasn't sure what to say. She didn't know how to talk to someone who had just bought her. It was a strange feeling, but the soldier didn't seem to mind her silence. He simply sat beside her, keeping the pace steady and calm. Eventually, as the sun began to set, they reached a small house on the outskirts of a quiet village. It was simple, made of stone and wood, with a small garden in the front. The soldier stopped the cart in front of the house and helped Lyra down. "This is where I live," he said, his voice soft. "You'll be safe here." Lyra looked at the house, unsure of what to think. She had been sold to this man, but he hadn't hurt her. He hadn't treated her like a thing to be used. Instead, he had treated her like a person. It didn't make sense. No one had ever treated her like that before. Not even her real parents. The soldier smiled gently at her, his eyes kind but tired. "You're not alone anymore," he said, as if reading her mind. Lyra didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to thank him, how to explain the flood of emotions she was feeling. She had been sold, but in a way, she had also been saved. Saved from a life of endless pain and fear. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in her life, she had hope. The soldier led her inside, and she followed, feeling the weight of her past slowly lift, replaced by something new. Something she hadn't dared to dream of for so long. A chance at a life she could call her own. A new beginning. Lyra had never felt so unsure of anything in her life. She had spent so long in fear, so long believing that there was no hope for her future. But now, standing inside this small stone house, something inside her began to change. The soldier had been kind to her. He hadn't treated her like a slave. But could she trust him? Could she really believe that this was a new beginning? The house was simple, with a small fireplace in the corner and a small table near the window. There were no fancy decorations, nothing that seemed out of place. But there was something warm about it, something that made Lyra feel like she could belong here. The soldier led her to a small room at the back of the house. It was simple but clean, with a small bed, a wooden chair, and a table with a few things on it. Lyra looked around, unsure of what to do. She didn't know if she should say something, if she should thank him, or if she should just stay quiet. For so long, she had learned to keep her thoughts to herself, to be silent in the face of everything. "Here," the soldier said, pointing to the bed. "You can rest here. I know you must be tired." Lyra nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She felt like she was living in a dream. Everything had happened so fast. One moment, she had been at the auction, feeling like her life was over. The next, she had been taken from that place and brought here. It was all so confusing. The soldier didn't seem to mind her silence. He simply gave her a small smile before leaving the room. "I'll prepare something for dinner," he said, closing the door gently behind him. Lyra sat down on the bed, her hands resting in her lap. She couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. She had been bought, but the soldier had been kind. He hadn't treated her like the others. He hadn't yelled at her, or pushed her, or made her feel small. He had given her space, let her breathe. It was something she hadn't experienced in so long. But was it real? Could this really be a new beginning for her, or was it just another dream that would fade away when she woke up? Lyra closed her eyes, trying to push the thoughts out of her mind. She wanted to believe. She wanted to believe that this was different, that this man, this soldier, wasn't like the others. But how could she know for sure? The sound of footsteps in the hallway brought her back to the present. The soldier knocked softly on the door before opening it. In his hands, he carried a small tray with food. "I hope this is okay," he said, setting the tray down on the table. "It's just some bread and soup. It's all I have for now." Lyra looked at the food. It wasn't much, but it smelled warm and comforting. She hadn't eaten much lately, and the thought of a warm meal made her stomach growl. She nodded, trying to find the words to thank him. But again, the words wouldn't come. The soldier smiled gently. "It's not much, but it's all I can offer right now." Lyra took a deep breath and looked up at him. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it was enough. Enough to show him that she was grateful. The soldier nodded, his eyes kind. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I'm just glad you're safe now." The kindness in his voice made Lyra's heart ache. She had never heard anyone speak to her like that before. For so long, she had been told she was nothing. For so long, she had been treated as if she didn't matter. But this man, this soldier, treated her as though she was important, as if her life meant something. "Are you hungry?" he asked, breaking the silence. Lyra nodded. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until she smelled the food. She moved toward the tray and picked up the bowl of soup, taking a small spoonful. The warmth spread through her, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Comfort. It was strange, but it was real. The soldier watched her quietly, standing near the door, but not in a way that made her feel uncomfortable. He wasn't watching her like a master watching a servant. He was just standing there, waiting patiently. Lyra finished her soup quickly, and the soldier took the empty bowl from her, replacing it with a slice of bread. He didn't rush her. He simply waited until she was finished. When she was done, he smiled again. "You look tired. You can sleep now if you want." Lyra nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her bones. She hadn't had a good night's sleep in ages. She wasn't sure how long it had been since she had last slept peacefully. But now, in this quiet room, with the soldier's kindness filling the space, she felt safer than she had ever felt before. The soldier gave her a gentle nod. "I'll be outside if you need anything," he said quietly. "You're safe here." As he left the room, Lyra lay down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing. This was different. This place was different. For the first time in a long time, she felt a small spark of hope. A new beginning wasn't just a dream. It was real. And maybe, just maybe, this soldier could help her find a life that wasn't filled with pain. Lyra closed her eyes, allowing herself to finally relax. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe again. Growing closer, days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Lyra's life began to change. The house, once strange and unfamiliar, started to feel like home. She had never known a life like this, peaceful, calm, and free of fear. The soldier, whose name she had learned was John, never rushed her or made her feel small. Instead, he offered her kindness, something she hadn't thought she'd ever receive again. At first, Lyra didn't know how to act. She had been taught to keep her distance from others, to never show her true feelings. But John was different. He didn't make her feel like she owed him anything. He simply expected her to be herself. And slowly, Lyra began to open up. Each morning, John would wake up early to care for the small garden outside the house. Lyra would watch him from the window, unsure of whether she should help or stay inside. She didn't want to be in his way. But one morning, after he had finished tending to the garden, John turned to her with a smile. "You're welcome to help if you want," he said gently, wiping the sweat from his brow. The garden could use an extra pair of hands. Lyra hesitated, unsure. She had never worked in a garden before. Her stepmother had never taught her such things, only how to clean and cook, and never with love. But there was something in John's voice, a quiet warmth, that made her want to try. She nodded slowly and stepped outside. At first, Lyra wasn't sure what to do. She watched as John carefully dug into the soil, planting seeds with careful hands. She stood beside him, unsure of where to start. John smiled at her, as if he could sense her nervousness. "Just help me with the weeds first," he said, handing her a small shovel. "Don't worry about making it perfect. Just try your best." Lyra took the shovel, feeling the coolness of the earth beneath her fingers. It was strange, this feeling of working with someone. She had never worked alongside another person before, but there was something calming about it, something that made her feel like she wasn't alone. As she dug into the ground, she found herself forgetting her past, forgetting the pain, and focusing only on the task at hand. For the first time in a long while, she felt useful. She wasn't just a slave. She wasn't just a thing. She was helping. She was part of something. John worked beside her, not rushing her, not telling her she was doing anything wrong. His presence was reassuring, and Lyra found herself starting to look forward to their quiet mornings together in the garden. As the days passed, Lyra began to feel more comfortable around John. They would work together in the morning, and in the afternoon, they would sit on the porch and talk. At first, their conversations were small, simple questions about their lives. But as time went on, their talks became deeper, more personal. Lyra told him about her life, about the pain she had endured, about her stepmother's cruelty, and about the auction. John listened without judgment, his eyes soft with understanding. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," he told her one afternoon, his voice gentle. "But if you do, I'm here to listen." Lyra had never met anyone who wanted to listen to her before. Not like this. She had always been seen as weak, as someone who couldn't fight for herself. But John didn't see her that way. He didn't see her as a broken thing. He saw her as a person. One evening, after they had finished their work for the day, John sat beside her on the porch. The sky was painted with colors of orange and pink as the sun began to set. "Lyra," he said, his voice quiet, "I'm glad you're here. I know things haven't been easy for you, but I want you to know that you're safe now. You don't have to worry anymore." Lyra looked up at him, her heart beating faster. For so long, she had been afraid to believe that anyone could care for her. But there was something in his words, something in the way he spoke that made her feel like she wasn't just a slave or a victim. She was a person who deserved kindness, who deserved peace. I'm not used to this," Lyra said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to be someone who is cared for." John looked at her, his eyes full of compassion. "You don't have to know how right now. All that matters is that you're here, and I'm here. You don't have to do anything but be yourself." Lyra felt a lump form in her throat, her emotions threatening to spill over. She had never been told anything like that before. For so long, she had been told she was nothing. But now, this man, this soldier, was telling her she was worthy of love and kindness. Without thinking, Lyra reached out and touched his hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt big. She wasn't sure why she did it, but she knew it was right. John didn't pull away. Instead, he gave her a soft smile and gently squeezed her hand. "You're not alone," he said quietly, his voice low and soothing. Lyra felt something shift inside her. It was as if a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had been lifted. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't a slave anymore. She was Lyra, a person with hopes and dreams. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in that. The days grew warmer, and Lyra's life continued to change. She wasn't sure where this path would take her, but she knew one thing. With John by her side, she was no longer afraid to walk it. The soldier's proposal. The days seemed to stretch into one peaceful moment after another. Lyra had never known such calm, such warmth. Every morning, she would wake up to the sound of birds singing outside, and every evening, she would sit on the porch with John, watching the sunset paint the sky. Life had become simple, but in the best way. Over time, Lyra's heart began to feel lighter. She was no longer the broken girl who had been sold at the auction. She was someone who was slowly rebuilding her life, piece by piece, and much of that rebuilding had to do with the kindness of John, the soldier who had saved her. John never pushed her to do anything she wasn't ready for. He never tried to hurry her healing. He just gave her the space to grow and heal at her own pace. It was something Lyra had never experienced before. She wasn't being rushed or forced into anything. She was allowed to simply be. One evening, as the sun began to set, John came to her with a serious look on his face. It was different from his usual calm and friendly demeanor. Lyra noticed the change right away, her heart suddenly racing in her chest. She had learned that when John looked this way, it meant something important was about to happen. "Lyra," he said, his voice softer than usual, "there's something I need to ask you." Lyra felt her palms grow sweaty. She wasn't sure what was going on, but she knew it was something that would change everything. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. John took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. He looked into her eyes, his gaze full of sincerity. "I've been thinking a lot about the life we've been building here. I know things haven't always been easy for you, but you've become so important to me. You've shown me strength I didn't know existed, and I admire that more than I can say." Lyra looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she felt a warm feeling spread through her. John's words had always been kind, but there was something different now. He was looking at her like she was more than just a person he had saved. She was someone who mattered deeply to him. John stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently hold hers. "Lyra, I know this might seem sudden, but I want to ask you something important. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to be there for you through everything, to give you a future that is filled with love and peace. Will you marry me?" The words hung in the air, as if time had stopped. Lyra's eyes widened in surprise. She had never imagined such a thing. Marriage. The thought had never crossed her mind. She had been so focused on surviving, on just getting through each day, that she hadn't allowed herself to dream about the future. But now, as she looked into John's eyes, something deep inside her stirred. She could see the love and sincerity in his gaze. He wasn't just asking her out of kindness. He was asking because he truly cared for her. He wanted to build a life with her. And for the first time in a long time, Lyra realized that she might actually want that too. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that John had given her something priceless. The chance to live a life without fear. A life where she wasn't just a slave, but a woman with a future that she could share with him. Lyra's throat tightened as she tried to find the words. "John," she began, her voice shaky. I never thought I could have a life like this. I never thought I would be asked to marry someone like you, but you've shown me what kindness is. You've shown me that I am more than what I thought I was." She paused, taking a deep breath. Yes, I will marry you." A smile spread across John's face, and for a moment, it felt as though the whole world had brightened. Lyra's heart swelled with emotion, and she could hardly believe what she had just said. But it was true. She was ready to build a future with him. She was ready to start a new chapter of her life. John gently pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if afraid to let go. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've made me the happiest man alive." Lyra rested her head against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her. She closed her eyes and let herself feel the warmth of his embrace. She had never known a love like this, a love that wasn't born out of fear, but out of respect, trust, and care. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Lyra realized something. She wasn't just marrying a soldier. She was marrying the man who had saved her, who had given her a second chance at life, who had shown her that she was worthy of love and happiness. And for the first time, Lyra felt truly free. The world outside was quiet, the stars beginning to appear in the night sky. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for their answer. And in that moment, Lyra knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. John had given her more than she could have ever dreamed of. And now, they were going to face the future hand in hand, building a life together, one step at a time. A new life together. The first day of their new life together was calm and full of hope. The sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light on the small house where Lyra and John now lived. For the first time in many years, Lyra felt like she was in a place where she could breathe without fear. It had only been a short time since John had proposed to her, but already Lyra felt like a different person. She was no longer the scared girl who had been sold at the auction. She was now a woman with a future she could share with someone who cared for her deeply. And that someone was John, the soldier who had saved her and shown her a kindness she had never known. The house was small, but it was peaceful. There was a garden in the backyard where John had started planting vegetables and flowers. The air smelled fresh, and the sounds of birds singing in the trees made everything feel alive. Lyra had never known a place like this. She had always lived in places where she was forced to work hard, to stay hidden, or to be quiet. But here, with John, she was allowed to be herself. No one told her what to do. No one forced her to act in a certain way. That morning, after they had breakfast, John turned to her with a smile. "How about we start planning our life together? There's so much we can do here, and I want us to make it our own." Lyra looked at him, her heart swelling with emotion. John wasn't rushing her. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He just wanted to help her feel comfortable in their new life. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft. "Well," John said, "we can start by making this house ours. We can decorate it the way we want. And then, we can make plans for the future. What kind of life we want to have, where we want to go, what we want to do." Lyra felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. No one had ever asked her what she wanted. Her life had always been decided for her. But now, John was asking her opinion, asking her to be part of the decisions. For the first time, Lyra felt like she was in control of her own life. I've never thought about those things," Lyra said, her voice hesitant. "I've always just tried to survive. I didn't have time to think about what I wanted. But I'd like to try." John smiled warmly, stepping closer to her. "That's all I want, Lyra. For you to have the chance to dream again. We'll do it together, one step at a time." They spent the morning working on the house. John showed Lyra how to hang up pictures, how to arrange the furniture in the living room, and how to care for the small garden outside. For the first time in a long time, Lyra felt useful. She wasn't just working to survive anymore. She was working to build a life that belonged to her and to John. As they worked, they talked. John told her stories about his past, about the places he had traveled to when he was in the army, about the things he had seen and done. Lyra listened closely, fascinated by his words. She had never met anyone who had lived a life like his, and as she listened to him, she realized how much she wanted to know more. She wanted to learn about the world, to see things she had never seen before. In turn, Lyra shared her own stories with him. She told him about her childhood, about her stepmother's cruelty, and about the auction. John listened carefully, never interrupting, never judging her. He simply took her hand and said, "You don't have to carry that burden anymore, Lyra. I'm here now. And we'll make sure the future is better." That evening, after a long day of work, they sat on the porch together, watching the sunset. The colors of the sky were a mix of orange, pink, and purple, stretching across the horizon like a painting. Lyra felt peaceful. She had never felt so calm before. She wasn't sure if it was the quiet of the evening, or if it was the comfort of having John beside her. But for the first time in her life, she felt like everything would be okay. John took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "I know things haven't always been easy for you, Lyra, but I promise you this. I will always be here for you. We're in this together, for better or worse." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. She had never been told anything like that before. For so long, she had been alone. But now, she had someone who cared about her, someone who wanted to share a life with her. And in that moment, Lyra realized that she wasn't alone anymore. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For giving me a chance to live a life I never thought I could have." John smiled and pulled her close. "You deserve this, Lyra. You deserve a future full of happiness and love. And I'll do everything I can to give that to you." As the night settled in and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Lyra felt a sense of peace that she had never known before. The future was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. With John by her side, she could face anything. Together, they would build the life they both deserved. And as they sat in the quiet night, hand in hand, Lyra knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life. A life full of love, hope, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.